I'm always happy to speak for Plainfield Public Library when I'm able to. So we're going to jump in and get started. First, let's make sure everyone understands what the proprietary period is. So when we talk about the proprietary period in New Jersey, we are talking about 1664 to about 1702, 1703. So obviously there were some people in New Jersey prior to 1664 when the state was officially established, but this is what we call the proprietary period because of how the state was governed during that time. And it's when New Jersey came under British rule. But before Queen Anne established New Jersey as a unified royal colony. And the reason for the 1702-1703 discrepancy is because Queen Anne appointed Edward Hyde as her executive in New Jersey in 1702, but he didn't actually receive those instructions until 1703. So the changes didn't actually formally take place, although technically it was 1702 that they would have taken place. So in short, when we talk about the proprietary period, we are talking about 1664 to about 1703. And when you are researching ancestors that lived in New Jersey during the proprietary period, the key to successful research really is understanding the geography. The proprietary period's geography is very different. There are place names that are still referred to today that are not the same places that they are today. So they typically refer to larger areas, and we're going to look at some examples of that. But first, we're going to go over just some history. So in 1664, what marks that as an important date is when James, Duke of York, leased the land between the Hudson and the Delaware rivers, known as New Jersey, to Sir George Carteret and John Lord Berkeley, who became known as the Lords Proprietors. And the Lords Proprietors, Sir George Carteret was proprietor of East Jersey, and John Lord Berkeley was proprietor of West Jersey. And this specific, 1664 patent is what is separating East and West Jersey at the time, and with the dividing line that was in place at that time. And that changed over time. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the significance here is that these proprietors owned the land, had authority to sell it or partition it off, and also governed the inhabitants of their particular areas. So looking at New Jersey, the proprietors did own the land and govern the inhabitants, but in reality, land distribution and government was handled in some different ways. There are other things that governed how the government was structured, land distribution, what freedoms were available to new settlers, sometimes based on their religion, their race. So what was another important document is concessions and agreements of the Lords Proprietors of New Jersey, which was a document from 1665. So this is also something that's important that helped to establish how New Jersey was run at that point in time. So we're going to dive into East Jersey a little bit. East Jersey, the northern area of East Jersey, was actually greatly influenced by New York and the Dutch. So this area had a lot of people coming in from the former New Netherland colony, and there was a lot of influence there. So if you are researching people in East Jersey that lived in that northern area, they probably were Dutch. They probably attended Dutch Reformed churches and had a lot of influence in terms of land and how they interacted with other people from up north. The southern area, however, was more influenced by Puritans from New England. So those are different settlers from other areas in New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, but also from places in New York. So along the Hudson River Valley, from Kings County, which was Brooklyn, and from different places on Long Island. And a lot of those places in New York were filled at this time with inhabitants that had come from places in New England as well. So this is kind of developing a little bit of a picture of how New Jersey was established. Some of these early settlements, there were some issues in terms of disputes of who actually owned the land. So while all this was going on, Governor Nichols purchased land in New Jersey from the Indians. This was after all of New Jersey had already been granted to the proprietors, though. And this basically established settlements in Elizabethtown and also the settlement in Middletown and Shrewsbury. And that was actually in violation of the proprietors' rights. And what this did was led to many disputes between settlers and the proprietors for many, many years. East Jersey lands were impacted by the death of Sir George Carteret in 1680. So East Jersey was sold to 12 men, 11 Quakers who became the East Jersey proprietors. One of those shares went to Robert Barclay, who later became governor of the colony and settled in Perth Amboy, which was a capital. Looking at East Jersey, another interesting piece is that the Duke's 1664 grant was actually believed to include Staten Island and the land that is just over New Jersey's northern border in New York. So New York had actually secured Staten Island from Indians in the 1670s. And New Jersey never really went for it. They never claimed Staten Island, although the verbiage of that grant suggests that it would have included Staten Island because it included all of the land east of a certain point, and that would have included this little island in the water right next to New Jersey. But there was never really any dispute over that. When the Crown established the boundary line in 1769, that was excluding that northern territory from New Jersey. So we'll look at that in a little more detail later. So in East Jersey, there were what was called municipalities. Before different types of government were formed and before there were counties, there were municipalities, which were based on those early settlements or early areas of New Jersey. So those early settlements were very large. So these names that you're looking at here are obviously names of towns that exist today, but what we're talking about from the early period were much, much larger areas. So when we talk about Shrewsbury, it was a much larger area than what you think of as Shrewsbury today. Same goes for those other early settlements that became municipalities: Bergen, Newark, Elizabethtown, Woodbridge, Piscataway, and Middletown, in addition to Shrewsbury. So those were the very early settlements in East Jersey, and then more were added. More different kinds of municipalities were added. So Hackensack, for example, was established in 1693, and when it was actually 80 square miles in Bergen County. It's not the Hackensack that you think of today. Same thing goes for Aquaquonk and New Barbados. This was one township. The name I just read off was one township, not two separate ones. In East Jersey in Essex County, and that actually extended into what is today present day New York. And it covered several New Jersey counties in addition to that. So it was a very, very large area. Other municipalities that were established in 1693 were Perth Amboy and Freehold. So Perth Amboy at the time included not just what you think of as the small town of Perth Amboy today. It was all of present day Sayreville and South Amboy, and then parts of present day Monroe, Old Bridge, Jamesburg, and Spotswood. So Perth Amboy was a very, very large area. What this means is if you see that your ancestors lived in Perth Amboy in the early 1700s, or even a little bit after that, it doesn't mean that they lived in the city that you know today. Freehold was also an extremely large area. That area referred to all of present day Manalapan and Marlborough, and then also parts of what is present day actual Freehold, and then Millstone, Upper Freehold, Colts Neck, Old Bridge, Monroe, and Plumstead. So that actually extended, quite a bit west. A little bit about West Jersey. So Berkeley, one of the original two proprietors, sold part of his interest to John Fenwick in trust in 1673-74. And then John Fenwick began selling land to different settlers. So as I mentioned, there were lots of disputes over land. The legality of a lot of these transactions was questionable, but it did help establish much of what is today southern, what we know as South Jersey or southern New Jersey. Berkeley did still retain some of his interest in West Jersey, so he only sold part of it. In West Jersey, there were 4 men that later became West Jersey proprietors. And they basically, there was a Quaker colony that was developed. There was a lot of land contention in West Jersey as well that was more related to early Swedish and Dutch settlements that were there prior to 1664 and prior to any of this further partitioning off of lands and properties. In West Jersey, you had what was known as tenths. So there was a Salem tenth, a Yorkshire tenth, and the names of the tenths are indicative of who lived there and who purchased that land. So the Yorkshire tenth, for example, was purchased by 5 Yorkshire men, and that is the area in between Trenton and Burlington today. The London tenth was purchased by several Englishmen in 1677, and that is the area known as present-day some of Burlington and Pennsauken Creek. All of these tenths were established by different groups. And if you look into their history, you'll be able to better figure out where your ancestors were from if they were some of the very early settlers. So when we talk about these proprietary places, there may have been places that they were not an official municipality. They started out as a settlement, then they became a municipality, then they became a county, and then that county was broken off into towns that we know today. But there are a lot of references to obsolete place names that can be found in records. So you may find a place name in a land record that's not something you recognize today, or that's not easily Googleable. On the flip side, you may find a reference to a little town today in a very old record when that town wasn't actually even formed or created officially until many, many years later. But the area was always kind of referred to as that. And that may have been what the town got their name from. So a lot of these place names that exist in these records refer to small areas that are hard to identify. But on the flip side, there are also place names that exist today that are going to be referenced in those very early records that are probably very close nearby. So taking a look at what I had mentioned earlier about the New York border, you can see the Duke of York grant line in this image. That was the line in 1664. And you can see it goes a little bit above what the modern line is today, which is that dotted line where it says modern Orange County, modern Rockland County, and then below it, modern Bergen County. So that is the dotted line is the current line, but the original Duke of York grant from 1664 actually gave New Jersey a little bit more of New York. So if you have people that are in that area, it's interesting that they lived in what today is New York, but many of their early records are going to be in New Jersey records. You can see also some of the other lines where Passaic and Essex County are divided. Those modern lines now are different than the early lines from way back. So if you look at the area that is Hackensack now, it's not the area that was Hackensack back then. Also, Elizabethtown was a much larger area. Newark was a much larger area. So these place names that you see in early records, it's difficult to picture without doing some mapping and looking at deeds and boundary lines to figure out where they actually lived and what that area is known as today. Another thing that changed in the proprietary period over the years that you should be aware of, especially when you're looking at land records, if your ancestors lived in areas that were close to these boundary lines, is that surveyor George Keith established a new east-west boundary in 1687, 1688. And that shifted the dividing line in the left side image, which was a nice straight dividing line. it shifted it, and it reduced that northern part of West Jersey quite a bit. So looking at that, you can see where the changes were made up in kind of what was then the Essex County area. So keep that in mind. East Jersey, West Jersey, some lands were shifted back and forth over time, and this boundary line was something that changed on several instances. So again, keep in mind those proprietary places, and that's something that's going to be very important as we move on. And I'm going to share an example with you that is an interesting kind of extreme example, and this is used with permission from Joe Klett. This is his example from his special issue of the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey. Understanding New Jersey's geography during the proprietary period. So if we look at Shrewsbury Township, it was a very large municipality in 1693. And it spanned from present day Sandy Hook. So for those of you not in New Jersey, Sandy Hook is right where you see the words Perth Amboy on this map, that little hook that hooks up into the water near Staten Island and New York City. And so it spanned from present day Sandy Hook all the way down to the end of Long Beach Island. So Long Beach Island is that island alongside Monmouth County that goes all the way down. And then it goes inward quite a bit west to Plumstead, which is closer to the middle of the state. So that was Shrewsbury Township. It was very large. The area that is Monmouth in here, it was a good portion of that. So Shrewsbury Township in 1693. Now, looking at Shrewsbury Township today, it's just a little tiny area. It's a very small town in Monmouth County. There's lots of nice shopping there, but it's certainly not a large area like it was before. So if we look at a 1691 deed that was transferred to between two men, Joseph West received the land in 1691, and it was for land in Shrewsbury. So looking at that, you can't really tell, where exactly that was. And looking into it further, it's actually for land that is today in present day Ocean County, all the way down by Barnegat Township. So not anywhere close to Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury is where the little dot on the map is, and the land was actually way down by Barnegat Township where the star is. So when looking at these older deeds, you really have to do some digging and investigating to figure out where your ancestors actually lived, especially if the family continued to stay there, so that later on when records are organized a little bit differently, what county you're actually looking in, what township or what municipality your ancestors were actually living in when you're looking at local records. So the text that I referenced that this example is from is something that really is essential to understanding the proprietary period and being able to do research in the proprietary period. It's an excellent text. It has lots of details on specific places in proprietary New Jersey. I wish I could go into more detail on it. It's a special issue of the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey. It's currently actually out of print, but there is a place on GSNJ's website where you can get on a list for when it's back in print. There is a revised version of it in the works, and it should be back in print soon. Looking at that, another good reference is John Snyder's The Story of New Jersey's Civil Boundaries, which is available as a PDF if you Google it. It's available through a New Jersey state website, and you can just download the PDF, but it has lots of details on places. You can't research in the proprietary period without this. You'll find lots of those kind of obsolete place names, or knowing exactly what municipalities stemmed off from other larger areas and initial settlements from early on. Knowing kind of what the parent and child counties and areas were is something that you'll find in this book. So diving into some of the actual records, the East Jersey Proprietors was a corporation that was actually only recently dissolved in 1998. About 25 years ago. The records were transferred to the New Jersey State Archives when they were dissolved. So the records are very abundant. There are lots of minutes. Remember, this was the governing organization. So it's not just a mechanism for recording land transactions. This was the government. So there are minutes published. They're published in books that you can find online. You can find at state archives and other libraries through about 1794. And then some things are not published as well. There are lots of records related to land. So deeds, surveys, warrants, lots of records related to land. I will say it's not the same as going in and researching land records from, say, the 1920s or 30s or 40s, where you'll probably find a pretty clear title from one buyer to the next. These are very hit or miss because not everything was recorded. If it was recorded, there are things that were lost over time. And so it's very hit or miss. There are lots of other kinds of records as well. There are road records, quit rent records, dividends. Remember, this was a corporation. They were transacting business. Maps. There are some beautiful maps in the East and West Jersey Proprietors collections, and other records as well. The West Jersey Proprietors is still an active corporation. There's still actually a lot of land in New Jersey that is owned by the West Jersey Proprietors that has not been developed or settled. They're still an active corporation, but their records are on deposit at the New Jersey State Archives. And those records include a lot of the same types of records as I mentioned for East Jersey. There are minutes, there's account books, different kinds of land transactions, surveys, warrants, the notes on the Lawrence Line division. Some of them are included in the West Jersey Proprietors records. There are lots of maps and drawings. There are maps and drawings on many of the land records, but there also are a lot of separate maps and drawings, and then a lot of just miscellaneous records as well. So looking at some examples of records that you can find, this is just a simple survey. It's undated, but I can place the date at approximately June 1715 based on another record I'll show you in just a moment. This was surveyed for John Campbell, who is noted to be the son of John Campbell, Esquire. And it's for 200 acres of land on the branch of the Passaic River called the Dead River. And also the addition to the second dividend of land belonging to his 10th part of a propriety. So, and it's noted here that these lands were bordering the lands of Robert Barclay, deceased. So looking at a deed from 1715 for a similar related transaction. John Campbell, son of John Campbell, Esquire of Perth Amboy, and John Brown of the same place. And it's for also land on the Dead River. The land description is the same. So looking at these, there are a lot of different kinds of records that can be helpful to you. But again, they are hit or miss. I have families that I have multiple family lines that go back to East Jersey, and some of them have a ton of records and some of them have none. And it's really just very hit or miss. These records are they have been somewhat accessible over the years. If you did any land research, I would say 5, 10, 20 years ago, you're going to want to go back and do it again. The published indexes to the collections, which is what you had to rely on many years ago. I'm going to actually share a link in the chat at the end to a resource folder that has some outlines to these collections that are very abundant, too much to put in the handout. But these records you're going to want to take a look at again, because there's an early land records database on the New Jersey State Archives website that has been updated tremendously over the past couple of years. This is a database that even if you have seen the database and not just relied on the published books, The early land records database has had lots of updates over the past couple of years due to a project that we'll talk about in just a minute. So this has a lot more records from East Jersey than it does from West Jersey. But essentially what the database is you can type in a name. So I just typed in Johnson, just to be simple. And if you type in a name, you will see that some of these records are somewhat indexed and transcribed in the sense that you have some detail on the location. So you know whether this John Johnson is the right person. So in here, you can see that this this person and this transaction is referencing property in Salem area. It's a conveyance for 300 acres on Fenwick's River, beginning at Middle Creek. So you have a good land description there. For that 300 acres of land. It's about 1684. It names other people. So not just the people who are involved in the immediate transaction, but also people who were witnesses, surveyors, signatories, adjacent landowners, former landowners. So some of these are really detailed in their description and location. And some of them, as you can see here, you can actually open a PDF and see the actual image that's being referenced. Some of them have not yet been scanned. The one below it for John Smith in Pensauken Creek, survey for 1 acre of land, that one is not indexed. So that's part of West Jersey loose records, and you have to go into the archives and access that. So some of this is good in the sense that you can do some research before you go to the archives, but some of it is available as PDFs as well. So that's going to be, again, something that is a little bit hit or miss. So the early land records project that I mentioned is part of a GSNJ initiative that started in late 2016. And the goal was to create a name and place index, which is that early land records database that I just showed you, for about 80,000 land instruments that are held in over 60 collections. And that includes the records of the East and West Jersey proprietors, but it also includes other collections. So while the East and West Jersey proprietors owned the land and were able to sell it, and they governed their inhabitants, at the same time, land transactions from this period can be recorded in multiple places. Some of them may be held in private collections. Some of them may be recorded many, many years later when the counties individually started recording land. There are lots of different collections where there are early land records that are being processed and being indexed and included in this database that are not just the official records of the East and West Jersey proprietors. And if this works, which it may not, oh, here. I think it's going to work. We're going to watch this video just quickly. Okay, so that's a little bit about the early land records project, so you can understand a little bit of perspective of where it's coming from, and how the records that are in that database have gotten there and where they came from. So, talking about some other types of records, land certainly is essential for doing research in proprietary New Jersey, although there are other records that are going to be helpful as well. Um, Wills in New Jersey start as early as the state was around about the 1660s. This says 1670, but there are some earlier wills in this collection. As well. So these books, Abstracts of Wills 1670 to 1730, are part of the New Jersey Archive series. You probably would know them as the bright orange books on the bookshelves at libraries, where you can look up to see if someone had a will. So these wills are wills that were originally filed with the proprietors. They are now arranged with all of the later New Jersey wills and filed with the Secretary of State, but everything is available at the state archives for all wills from very early period up to the 1900s are available at the archives. The good thing about these will abstracts is that they index all of the names in the will or administration or guardianship file that are included. So for example, looking at this is a will for one of my early New Jersey ancestors, Thomas Johnson. So he is the person who died and who had a will. So he's actually listed in this book alphabetically. So if you open up the book that covers 1694, which is the first book, one of the first books, you would go from A to Z looking for decedents, and he's under J. However, there's an index in the back of the book that also will include Joseph Johnson, Thomas Johnson, and John Johnson, because they are mentioned in the will. It also will include John Pruden and John Curtis because they are witnesses. So the good thing about this is if you have an ancestor and you're trying to figure out who their parents are, maybe they died in the proprietary period, maybe they died in the colonial period a little bit after that in the 1700s, you can look and see not just for their will, not just look for their will, but you can also look to see if they appear in anyone else's will, which will give you an idea and a sense of who their family may have been. And they might appear in someone else's will or in someone else's administration as a witness. They might appear as an administrator, someone who took an inventory of the estate. All of those names are listed in these indexes, in these abstracts. So the abstracts go through the early 1800s. So this is a set that spans the proprietary and the colonial period, and well into after that. There also are just general will indexes in New Jersey. There are two of them that are at the state archives as well, if you just want to look for a certain person's will. But these all point you to the right place to actually go get the will. They're great to use individually, but also good to use in collaboration with each other, especially if you are searching for someone and trying to figure out their parents, as I mentioned, looking to see if they appear in anyone's will, even as a witness, because that suggests some kind of possible relationship. The New Jersey Archive series also has other documents that are related to early New Jersey. So there are a lot of just miscellaneous documents that have been published in these New Jersey Archive series books. So for example, this is one, it's a commission for William Penton and others to be overseers at Salem, New Jersey. So some of these documents aren't necessarily essential. They're not going to provide, the name of someone's father or mother, but they are good for placing someone in a certain time and place that may be helpful, along with other evidence that helps to prove parentage during the colonial period or the proprietary proprietary period. So the New Jersey Archive series, definitely check that out. It's more than just the will abstracts, which I know many of you are used to using, and check out the other documents that have been transcribed and published in these. They are indexed. The actual documents or the actual volumes are indexed individually. So it's good to kind of do a general literature search in these when you're starting up a research project. Also for proprietary New Jersey, I know we mentioned that there are records related to land that are not recorded in those early East Jersey and West Jersey proprietors records that may actually be included in the county clerk's deeds. So we're going to get into this more in a little bit, but the counties started recording land transactions, your deeds and things like that, in 1785. However, that doesn't mean that everything that was recorded was from 1785 onward. Sometimes people came in and recorded a very old deed, but at that point in time, recordings were being done with the county clerks. So even though it was a deed from maybe 50, 75, 100 years earlier, it could have been recorded with the county clerk. Also taking a look at your other county and municipal records that may cover part of the proprietary period. There are common pleas records, quarter session minutes, the road records, road books, deeds and mortgages might be relevant to past transactions, and then some township committee minutes as well, and that'll be in the Dropbox link that I post at the end of the lecture. Excuse me. All right, so we're going to jump a little forward to the colonial period. Remember, 1702 to 1703 is when the proprietary period ends, and then it goes to about the 1780s, we're going to say. There's a little bit of lag there in terms of record keeping on both sides of when the colonial period technically ended, but basically it's the end of the proprietary period to statehood, or when the recording practices came into play. So looking at geography during this time, 1714 to 1775, this is essentially what New Jersey looked like. So you can see we don't have as many counties as we have today. For example, Monmouth and Ocean counties were one. Ocean County was not broken off from that yet. There are lots of other counties, Union County, that was not present yet. So those counties come later on, but this is essentially what New Jersey looked like during the colonial period. You can see the original line, the Keith line of the early one, and then the Lawrence line that comes later, or I'm sorry, the Lawrence line and then the Keith line that came to change it. And looking at those boundaries, figure out what area your family lived in. You can also see the northern New York boundary change there as well. So remember, during the colonial period, at the beginning, land records were still recorded with the East and West Jersey proprietors. So what we learned about land in the proprietary period, land records are still recorded there until 1785. Deeds were still probated in East and West Jersey, and they were filed with the provincial secretaries in East Jersey and West Jersey. They were later transferred to the Secretary of State, and they're all together, but that was the practice. However, during this time period, the counties started creating their own records. There also, as the colonial period, creeps up on us, more private family records are available and have survived, like personal papers, church records, family Bibles, a lot of church records for the proprietary period just simply have not survived. If they had, they would be good resources, but as we move on forward in time, there are more church records available, and certainly more family Bibles as well. And then some records are colony-wide records, as there was one colony instead of two areas, East Jersey and West Jersey. At some point, there were records that were created just kind of almost like statewide records today, but colony-wide records. So during the colonial period and even in the proprietary period, my first stop when I'm doing a research project is to look at periodicals. So doing a literature survey of the full run of the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, and then also of the proceedings of the New Jersey Historical Society, is a great first step. So if you're not familiar with these publications, they publish basically abstracts of records. They also will publish articles that people have written, but more importantly, they have published abstracts of records. So you may find that strange place that the person you're researching shows up, like in the record book for a local shoemaker, or they may have a marriage record at a church that, the record has been published in GMNJ, but you wouldn't have thought to look in that church because it's farther away from where you've known them to live. So looking at this can bring records to your attention that normally would be a lot harder to find. So doing a literature survey of a full run of these is a great first stop. You'll probably find a couple references to records that you can then pull and take a look at, and that gets you started on your project. The Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, as I mentioned, it has a lot of different kinds of records. So abstracts of records, there's written family histories in there. Also, our Bible records collection is published in there as well. So you can find Bible records that, have been referenced, and then you can go and pull the actual bound volume and look at the Bible record there. Also, lots of tombstone inscriptions have been published, and these are a lot of tombstones that were people went in the cemeteries and recorded the inscriptions 50, 60, 70 years ago, and therefore tombstones that are either unreadable or have been damaged, vandalized, destroyed in some way today. So it's a good thing someone did that then, because that is no longer a record that can be seen today. This is an example of an article from GMNJ. This is a Tanner and Courier's record book. So, finding something in here obviously is not going to give you the name of the person's parents or all their children, but it puts someone in the right place at the right time. And you may be able to figure out, oh, well, this is my Thomas Thompson, not the other Thomas Thompson, because the other Thomas Thompson's wife was deceased at this time. And this guy is buying paper pins for his wife. So clearly this is my person. And, and it helps you to put the right name to a person, or make sure that you're following the right research leads. Another example, there are a lot of records that are available in other places, more easily accessible online now, but still, capturing them in the literature survey is helpful. These are just marriage licenses, 1727 to 1734, that were copied and recorded in GMNJ many years ago. So to search GMNJ, there are 4 large volumes, like combination volumes, that index the first 50 years of GMNJ. After that, so volumes 51 and onward are indexed individually. So it's a little bit more tedious to search those. And it's even more tedious to search volumes 51 through 63, because the index includes surnames only. So if you're searching, unfortunately, for a name like Johnson, where there are a lot of them, you have to go and look at every volume, because you don't know which Johnson reference is to an Elizabeth Johnson or a James Johnson. Whereas all the other volumes, everything except 51 through 63, the index tells you Johnson, Alice, Bernard, Catherine, Dennis. It gives you the first name. So if you're not interested in Catherine and Bernard, you don't have to look at them. But unfortunately, 51 through 63 only have the surname reference. So you do need to go through all of those to really do a comprehensive search. There is also, if you're interested in kind of doing some digging into what GMNJ has to offer, there's an author and title listing on GSNJ's website where you can look and see, oh, well, what do they have for Newark, for Essex County, or what do they have for Westfield or Plainfield? And you can see if a local cemetery, if someone went in and recorded the tombstone inscriptions there. or you can see if the church that your ancestors went to, if their baptism records or something that has been transcribed and published in GMNJ. So take a look at that as well. But definitely doing a comprehensive literature search is a good start. The Proceedings of the New Jersey Historical Society is New Jersey Historical Society's journal that they've had for many years. Similar to GMNJ, it has abstracts of colonial era records. The volumes are indexed by name annually. There's no larger index like there is for GMNJ for volumes 1 through 50. And this was later titled New Jersey History. So if you see it on the shelf, it'll be known as the Proceedings, and then later it's called New Jersey History. So after that, the next step is sort of to look at some other abstracts. I usually do the will abstracts that we mentioned. They are the same for the colonial period as what we just talked about for the proprietary period, up to 1817. After 1817, there aren't will abstracts where you can search for any person that appears in the whole transaction, but you can look at the will indexes. And then also the newspaper abstracts as well. So the newspaper abstracts are also part of this archives period. So looking at the will abstracts, you're going to find the same information as the John Johnson example that I showed you, or I'm sorry, I forget which Johnson example I showed you, Joseph Johnson, maybe, that example that I showed you, it's going to have the same level of information, that little snippet, and then you just refer to the will. The newspaper abstracts are also, I guess, as I mentioned, part of the New Jersey Archive series. They are essentially things that appeared in the newspaper that seemed to be historically or genealogically relevant. So they were published in these early, archive series. So this is an example of one thing that wound up in the newspaper and that is included in the book. So Anna Margaret Winch, who married John Usbeck or Rhinebeck, someone was looking for her basically because her brother died and left her a sum of money. So this was basically the equivalent of a public notice, as you would see it today in the newspaper. So this is interesting though, because you know who her brother was. So if you're trying to figure out who her parents were, knowing who her brother was, that you have full documentation here that she had a brother and what their relationship is, that can be really helpful information. Also things like lists of letters. We've all seen these in newspapers, lists of letters in the post office. So this again is helpful for putting someone in the right time and place, or making sure that, for example, here you have Conrad and Mary Kelly in Cumberland County. So is that Mary Kelly your relative? How many Mary Kellys are there in Cumberland County? Looking at that might provide you with some insight on what you're looking for at the time, knowing that the time period that she was there. This is also related to a business. The partnership between Brian Lafferty and John Gaston of Bedminster is done. It's expired. If anyone has any demands, if they have any debts, come forward with them, basically. So this is, if your ancestor is John Gaston, knowing a little bit about his business can be helpful. And then this is a really good land description. So if this was your ancestor, it gives you definitely a better description of kind of where they lived and what that property was like than just looking at the simple land records. So knowing it was 20 acres of land, 5 are woodland, there's a house, a barn, orchards, 4 acres of salt meadow. This is very interesting. So this is, in reference to the fact that it's being sold. A couple of other good research strategies for colonial New Jersey research are to look at what finding aids are available. So some of these finding aids are very specific to certain areas. Charles Carroll Gardner tends to be, more Essex County, Morris County related, but there are other collections, Chester Jones collection, GSNJ's Tombstone Inscriptions collection, that are great because, like the will abstracts, they are kind of an index to everyone who's named in a record. So for example, this is a little index card that can be found in the Charles Carroll Gardner collection. It is referencing Lemuel Ward, and his name is on this card, and he has several cards in this collection, but this one references a quitclaim deed that's part of a manuscript collection in the New Jersey Historical Society. So these are personal papers of M.L. Ward, a relative of his, that that include a quitclaim deed from 1757, and he is one of many people who is named in this deed. And all of these people, I suspect, David Ward, Swain Ogden, Joseph Baldwin, Abraham Ogden, Nathaniel Ogden, Daniel Pearson, all of them, I would bet, have a index card just like this one, referencing this New Jersey Historical Society manuscript collection. So this, if I had, thought to even look at the Ward papers in this collection, I may have passed by this because it's not his, exact record or file. So there's a lot of things like this in the Charles Carroll Gardner collection that reference, church records. This is referencing personal papers. Some of them reference family trees that have been submitted to GSNJ. So this is just a good collection to see what random records your ancestor may appear in. It may not be a record directly related to them, like their land transaction or their child's baptism. They may have been a witness to, someone's marriage, and that's why they have a record in there. This is a family tree that's part of Charles Carroll Gardner's bound collection for my family. So this was, something that was put together by someone who actually knew a lot of these people. This person was born in the 1920s, and he put this family tree together. So a lot of these people were, born in, I'm sorry, he was born in the 1820s. He died in the 1920s, and he put a lot of this together, and then it was copied by his son. So obviously subject to, some error, but the person who is listed on here actually knew some of these people who, who were around when he was 12, 13, 14, but died in the 1850s. So he had personal knowledge in many cases for this. So this is not just your typical hand-drawn family tree that probably has a million errors in it. These were people that he actually knew. Also, for Colonial New Jersey research, another extremely important resource is the Supreme Court records. There's a database on the New Jersey State Archives website that is very similar to the other archives interfaces, like the early land records one that I just showed you. And its entries do include some abstracts of actual records, just like the ones that we saw for the land records database. The Supreme Court records are, cases that this is a statewide database. So there are lower courts that handle different types of cases, but this is the state Supreme Court cases. So if we go in and search for Johnson, Elizabeth Johnson, you'll find, or just Johnson in general. Actually, I think this was a search for Elizabeth or John Johnson. Looking in here, you'll find a couple of different cases. I've specified Essex County. So looking at this, we can find, the ones that possibly are of interest. So if I want to see the dower case for Elizabeth Baldwin, wife of Nathan Baldwin, who was previously Elizabeth Ball, the widow of Silas Ball, and her case against John Johnson, that's something that we can pull. That's record 3697. You can pull it at the state archives. There are a couple different versions of the search on the Supreme Court records site. So for example, if you wanted to search all of the Johnson / Baldwin plaintiff defendant combinations, because there's a court case, I have ones in my family that went on for years, you can use version 3 to search for any kind of combination of Johnson Baldwin as plaintiff defendant. So check out the different versions of the search. Some of them allow you to see different things than others. For example, one of those, the version 2 search will allow you to click on the case number, and you can click on that and view some additional detail there. This is the version 3 search where I mentioned you can search for Johnson and Baldwin combinations there. So take a look at that. And sometimes you can see also a little bit more of a description of what actually happened in the case, who was involved in it, who was named as a witness. But of course, you always want to pull the original records. The summary there is nice, but it's not going to include everything that you're looking for. And there might be a slight detail in there that's helpful to you. Another database on the State Archives site is the marriage bonds database. These are Colonial marriage bonds. Not every couple who was getting married during this period had a marriage bond. Essentially what it was, the bond was someone affirming that neither party has, each party had a person affirming that neither of them had there was no impediment to the marriage, meaning they weren't married to somebody else or anything like that. This did not happen for every single marriage that took place during this time period. So you won't find something for everything, but when you do find one, it helps to associate them with another person. The person providing their bond was probably someone that knew them well enough to be willing to put money on the line to affirm that this marriage could take place. So one thing that you can do here too, if you don't know the bride's maiden name, is you can search just by the bride's first name. So for example, this person was named Rachel Atkinson. I did not know the husband's name, and I did not know her maiden name. But looking at this, there were only two Atkinson men that married a woman named Rachel. So there may have been more and they just didn't have marriage bonds, but this is what's, available, and they are in Burlington County. So looking at this, it's either Rachel Shreve and Moses Atkinson or Rachel Wallace and Walker Atkinson. So looking at this database, you can find a reference to the marriage bond and pull it. It's not going to provide a ton of information, but it does associate them with the people that were providing the bond. And also looking at this, you can get a reference on when the marriage took place. So this date here that you see is the date of the bond. The marriage probably was very quickly after that, but it does help you to narrow that down if you're looking for a church record or another kind of record. And then for colonial research, I would also encourage you to take a look at different kinds of county and municipal records. Remember the county started recording land records in 1785, but those collections do include records that for transactions that took place prior to then. The counties started recording other types of records prior to 1785. So road returns can be helpful in terms of figuring out where someone lived, filling in gaps for land records. Partitions and divisions of estate in New Jersey are an interesting type of record. I've found them to be very helpful, in cases where they do exist. But if you have someone who died and had no will, so there's an administration, if they had quite a bit of land, there's a good chance that there may be a record that is filed actually with the surrogate's office, even though it's a land related record, for a partition or division of the estate. So if they had an administration, there's no will directing who gets their land, so their land may have been divided up. If they had a large tract of land and 7 kids, that land may have been divided 7 ways, and the 7 kids got different pieces of it, and they may have sold it off, they may have kept it. But those they sometimes have beautiful maps that come along with them, that have a lot of detail about the property and who was, allotted which part of it. Mortgages were started to be filed with the counties earlier than land records, in about 1766. But again, they may have been referencing much earlier mortgages. So, looking at the colonial period, you definitely want to check that out. Another thing that's really important that I've found really helpful for the colonial period is looking at some of the miscellaneous record books for the counties. So the county clerk's offices each have miscellaneous record books. And what they are recordings that didn't fall under the norm. So there are books for deeds, there are books for mortgages, there are nowadays there's books for military discharges and things like that. But things that were not the norm are filed in miscellaneous record books. Most of them are indexed, and they have some great records that we'll look at in just a second. Also think about other kinds of records like tavern licenses and local court records. So how do you know if the area that you're researching in has these kinds of records? Because they are very hit or miss. The best way to look at this is to go to the State Archives website, drill down to search the collections, and then search by county and then municipal or municipality. So the way to do this, this is a clipping or a screenshot of the State Archives website. If you click on county government records under other records, it takes you to a listing of the counties, and you can browse by county to see what kinds of records the archives has for that county. So just as an example, we're going to click on Salem County and see what kinds of records they have. And this is just 3 of many that they have. But one thing that you might be interested in are, say, Justice of the Peace dockets, 1758 to 1948. So that covers a wide range of years, but some of it is in the colonial period. Also, you may be interested in Chancery Court, the Oyer and Terminer records. So this was a lower county court. And you can take a look at that and see if there are any records of interest to you. So this is a good way to see what is available, at least from the state archives, for each county. The county may have records that they've retained and not sent to the state archives, but this is a good start and a good way to make sure that you are understanding what records are actually available for the county. I mentioned the miscellaneous record books. These are really interesting. They have a lot of great just miscellaneous records. And it's easy to search them. They're mostly indexed, so you can check and see if your ancestor recorded something that is of interest. This is referencing Uzal Ogden, and he was the guard. He's my relative, but he was the guardian of a Thomas Foster, who was under 20 years of age and who wanted to become a citizen of the US. And because of that, he was stating in here his birth details. So he was born in St. Croix. He's the son of Joseph Foster, who is deceased. He was born 1790 and is age 17 years and 30 days. And then he came from that island in 1798 and has since resided with the family. So this is, referencing something that is not a little bit outside of the colonial period, but some of these are, things that are referencing marriages, military transactions, things like that, could have taken place long ago. This is a marriage in a Essex County record book, referencing a marriage that took place in 1793 in Scotland. And it was recorded in 1803 in New Jersey. So these are just a couple examples. The miscellaneous record books cover a variety of time periods, but they are, a great way to, find records that you normally would not have even known existed. So taking a look at, kind of the the different kinds of records that are available for the colonial period, definitely start with the literature search. That's the best way to go, and then continue on to really understand what is available for the area and the time period that you're looking in, and that will help to set you up for success while you're researching your colonial ancestors. And if anyone has questions about proprietary or colonial research, I would be happy to answer them.